Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At this time, we will reconvene into open session this meeting of the Arlington Independent School District Board of Trustees on June 10th, 2021, beginning at 7:21 p.m. We will start our meeting with the opening ceremony. Please join Mr. Chapa in leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please silence all cell phones and any electronic devices to avoid any disruption to those around you. And now, if you would please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. So the first item on our agenda is our program presentation. It is going to be our presentation for the recognition of the J. Woodrow Count Scholarship recipients. Ms. Talisa Brown, will you please come to the podium and share this great news with us?
Good evening, President Mays, Dr. Cavazos, and members of the board. I am Talisa Brown, and I'm the Director of the Guidance and Counseling Department. It is an honor for me to present the recipients of the 2021 J. Woodrow Counts Scholarship. A committee at each high school selects the application of an outstanding senior to be considered by the final selection committee. The J. Woodrow Counts Scholarship is awarded for the purpose of advancing a student's education at an institution of higher learning. The recipients are seniors who have earned high academic achievements, demonstrated strong leadership qualities, and possess a unique combination of talents. Before I present the awards tonight, let me give you a short biography of Mr. Counts. Mr. Counts was born in Byram, Texas. He grew up there and graduated from Byram High School. He attended what is now the University of North Texas on a basketball scholarship. After college, he served his country during World War II as a U.S. naval officer. In 1949, Mr. Counts began his educational career with Arlington Independent School District, where he spent 36 years before retiring as superintendent in 1985. The J. Woodrow Counts Administration Building is named in his honor. Mr. Counts took great pride in Arlington schools. He died in October 2006 at the age of 90. His legacy will live on through the scholarship that he established and funded. It is my pleasure to present the 2021 J. Woodrow Counts Scholarship recipients. This year, 3 students received a $1,000 scholarship award. The first recipient, Rihanna Pino. Rihanna is a 2021 graduate of Martin High School. She is planning to attend the University of Texas at Austin this fall, and she will study biology on the pre-medicine path. Her plan is to be a neurosurgeon. She was driven to pursue this career after witnessing her grandfather suffer with Alzheimer's. It is her hope to help others struggling with Alzheimer's as well as other conditions of the brain by offering them a chance for a better life while keeping the memory of her grandfather in her heart. Unfortunately, Rihanna was unable to be here tonight. Our next recipient, Morgan Worley. Morgan is a graduate of Seguin High School. She is planning to attend the University of Texas in Arlington this fall. Her goal is to study nursing with a minor in Spanish. Unfortunately, Morgan was not able to be here today. Anna Lewis is our next recipient. She is a 2021 graduate of Lamar High School. I am so excited that Anna is here with us today. I'm going to ask Anna to please join me to share her plans with you tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Brown, for the introduction. My name is Anna Lewis. I recently graduated from Lamar High School, and in the fall, I will be attending the University of Oklahoma to study biology, also on a pre-medicine track. I, unlike the other girl, don't exactly have my exact specialty worked out yet, but I'm hoping to figure that all out in college. And I would just like to say it is such an honor to win this award, and it is such an honor to be able to be here and speak at tonight. So thank you all.
Thank you, Anna, would you like to recognize anyone who's here with you this evening?
I am here with
Go ahead and come back to the mic so everybody can hear you.
I am here with my lovely mother, Lisa Lewis, who has always supported me, and I thank her deeply for that. So
Thank you. Congratulations.
Please help me congratulate all of these outstanding students. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Thank you. Wow, well, congratulations, and what a way to carry on a legacy through monetary giving to students that are so deserving, and to be selected from all of the high schools, to Rihanna, to Morgan, to Anna, congratulations, and good luck. Okay, so next on the agenda, we have our administrative appointments. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, President Mays, and I'd like to recommend that the board ratify the appointment of the individuals discussed in closed session for Principal of Bergen Elementary, Associate Principal for the Center of Visual and Performing Arts, Associate Principal for Cookin Educational Center, Assistant Principal for Barnett Junior High, Assistant Principal for Adams Elementary, and Assistant Principal for Sherrod Elementary.
Okay, do we have a motion for administrative ratifications?
Move for approval. Second.
Okay, so we've got a motion by Mr. Hogg, a second by Mr. Chapa. Any discussion? Seeing none, please vote. All present vote in the affirmative. The motion passes. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, President Mays. The new principal for Bergen Elementary is Karen Tufts. And so Karen attended the University of Texas at Arlington for Bachelor of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies, UT Arlington for Master of Education in Ed Leadership and Policy Studies. Most recently was the principal at Amos Elementary, has been an assistant principal at Miller Elementary, has also taught math at the 6th and 7th grade and the 5th grade, and has been an academic specialist, and has been a 5th grade science teacher as well. So congratulations to Karen. She's well on her way. Since this is a ratification, they've already started working. The next is the associate principal for the Center of Visual and Performing Arts, is Kathy Isaacs. And Kathy attended Texas Christian University for Bachelor of Science in Physical Ed, UT Arlington for Master of Ed in Leadership and Policy Studies. Most recently was the Dean of Instruction at the Center for Visual and Performing Arts, has been an assistant principal in middle school, a dance director, a dance and theater director, and a business owner as well. Next is the associate principal for Cookin Educational Center, and that's Elizabeth Hubner. Elizabeth has attended the University of Texas Arlington for Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, and Lamar University for Master of Ed in Ed Leadership. Most recently was the academic dean at South Davis, has been an instructional coach at South Davis, instructional coach at Thornton, bilingual teacher at Cookin, bilingual pre-K teacher at Rourke, and has also worked as a child life assistant. Next is Michael Woods, assistant principal for Barnett Junior High. Attended University of Houston for Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology, UT Arlington for Master of Ed in Administration. Most recently, a 6th and 7th grade science teacher and assistant athletics coordinator at Carrollton Farmers Branch ISD. Has been also an 8th grade science teacher at Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. Has taught science, different school districts, and reading as well. That's Michael Woods, assistant principal at Barnett Junior High. New assistant principal for Adams Elementary is Shelby Sanders. Shelby attended Angelo State University for Bachelor of Science, Angelo State for Master of Education and Ed Administration, most recently a resource and inclusion teacher at Patrick Elementary, and has taught alternate curriculum as well. Next, assistant principal for Sherrod Elementary is Deja Botang, and her background is UT Arlington, Bachelor of Business and Marketing, UT Arlington for Master of Ed and Ed Leadership and Policy Studies, most recently the Dean of Instruction at Sherrod Elementary, and has been a history teacher at Carter Junior High. So congratulations to these appointments, and someday we'll have a big ceremony in welcoming these individuals and to the district and to their new positions, and to congratulate them as well.
It will be very big, Dr. Cavazos. Okay. Next are considering administrative appointments. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, President Mays, and I'd like to recommend that the board appoint the individuals discussed in closed session for Assistant Superintendent for School Leadership Elementary and Assistant Superintendent of School Leadership Secondary.
Okay, do I have a motion? Okay, do I have a second? Okay, a motion from Dr. Reich, a second from Mrs. Fowler. Any discussion? Seeing none, please vote. All present, vote in the affirmative. Motion passes.
Thank you, President Mays. And so our new Assistant Superintendent of School Leadership for Elementary is Dr. Christy Buell. You can give her a round of applause. She happens to be here. Christy attended Texas A&M University. I had to pause for that. So, okay, for Bachelor of Science for Educational Curriculum and Instruction, East Texas State University for Master of Ed in Ed Administration, and then Texas A&M University Commerce for Doctor of Education in Ed Administration. Most recently, Dr. Buell has been our area superintendent, has been a principal at Mary Moore Elementary, has been an executive director of school leadership in Dallas, has worked in Hillsborough County Public Schools as an executive leadership coach, principal, a supervisor generalist of curriculum and instruction, has been a principal in several school districts, a director of training and design, and assistant principal and classroom teacher. Dr. Buell, congratulations on this appointment, and if you'd like to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Good evening, President Mays and Dr. Cavazos and school board members. It's such an honor to be here tonight. I can't express how proud I am to be such a part of such a great district. I've had the privilege of coaching and supervising such talented principals over the last 7 years in AISD. I've had the opportunity to visit classrooms on a daily basis and see great teaching and learning taking place. I get to celebrate the success of our students. I think I have the best job in the world. I'm proud of our focus on equity, on leadership development, and our unrelenting commitment to excellence. I look forward to the opportunity to serve in this new capacity in Arlington ISD as the Assistant Superintendent of Elementary Schools. I'm committed to ensuring that all students in AISD receive the highest quality education. I want to thank Dr. Cavazos, Dr. Wirtz, Dr. Brown for supporting me to grow as a leader in AISD. I want to thank the many principals across the district that I've had the privilege to work with and support. They're amazing leaders and have made my role as an area superintendent so rewarding. I also want to thank my husband, Greg, and my children, Mackenzie and Chandler, who couldn't be here tonight, for all of their support. Thank you again for this opportunity to lead in AISD.
Thank you, Dr. Buell. And our new Assistant Superintendent of School Leadership for Secondary is Dr. Lena McDonald. And Dr. McDonald could not be here tonight, but we will have her opportunity to say a few words. So Dr. McDonald attended Cameron University for Bachelor of Science in Physical Ed and Psychology, Wayland Baptist University for Master of Ed, A&M Commerce for Doctor of Educational Administration. Most recently, Dr. McDonald is our area superintendent, has been an assistant chief in academic support position, assistant superintendent of school leadership and development, and division director 9 through 12 schools and student support in Irving ISD, has been an assistant superintendent of instructional services, an associate director of instructional services, an executive director of instructional services, a principal, assistant principal, and a health psychology teacher coach. Has also taught in Waco ISD and coached, and has been a head women's basketball coach at the university level as well, and an assistant women's basketball coach as well. So congratulations to Dr. McDonald, and she'll have her opportunity when she's back to address the board. And give her a round of applause.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to both Dr. McDonald and Dr. Buell. Next on our agenda is a public hearing. As you see, we have none, so we will continue with our open forum for agenda items. As stated on the posted agenda, members of the public who desire to address the board regarding an item on this agenda are required to register by sending an email to the Superintendent of Schools Secretary, lbenjami@aisd.net, no later than 3 p.m. the day of the board meeting. Mrs. Benjamin, do we have any requesters registered to address the board regarding agenda items?
Yes, ma'am. We have one speaker, Mr. Stephen Poole, registered to speak.
Thank you very much. As Mr. Poole is walking to the podium, welcome, Mr. Poole. This is a routine part of the school board's agenda for regularly scheduled meetings. This segment of the meeting provides citizens with an opportunity to share their views with the trustees on items that are on the agenda tonight. It is not intended to be a discussion or a debate, and trustees will not reply to the speakers. Derogatory comments aimed at any individual will not be tolerated. Personnel matters are not appropriate subjects for open forum. You will have 3 minutes to speak. Mrs. Benjamin will notify you when your time is up, and please end your presentation at that time. Mr. Poole, your time starts now.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Mays, for the 3 minutes tonight. Good evening, and members of the board. I know a lot of work is going into the budget, and the budget process is nearing its end at the end of June. It's important work because the budget is a public statement of your beliefs and values. But I don't remember, it wasn't too long ago that you couldn't drive through Arlington without seeing some big bold signs that say, "Pay our teachers," asking support of the voters to pass a tax increase to do just that. And it passed overwhelmingly. The voters did approve a self-imposed tax increase to pay our teachers, and that's where this budget comes into play. So you can say it with me if you want. This budget should pay our teachers and our teacher assistants and our cafeteria and our custodians and our bus drivers and our secretaries and clerks. They have all worked very hard through the middle of a pandemic to get our students where they need to be, and they know there's big work to come. It's going to be important to pay our teachers to remain competitive, and I provided you our teacher salary comparison. Other districts are looking at providing salary increases themselves. So you have more work to do, and you know that. We've had those discussions. You've said that publicly. But there's also approximately $1.8 billion in federal funds in North Texas that needs to be spent by school districts in the next 3 years. So the hiring market is going to be extremely competitive, even more hyper-competitive than what it has been over the last decade. But we also have to compete with private sectors. Dallas Morning News on an article today about banks said Bank of America is increasing their minimum wage to $25 an hour. So our highly skilled, highly trained employees may find attractive offers in the private sector themselves. So we're hopeful that when the budget is all said and done, we're not only going to pay our teachers well, we're going to pay all employees who contributes to the success of our students well too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Poole. Next on our agenda is discussion action items. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, President Mays. And so tonight we bring for discussion the consideration of the preliminary 2021-2022 budget. And I'll just kind of set a little bit of context. There are a lot of different moving pieces to this budget. We know that there are ESSER funds, and just last Thursday we had another release of some ESSER funding. We know that there have been changes to valuations and things like that. And so I want to start off with a thank you to Ms. Moss and the entire finance division for their work in these changing times and things that we've gone through, COVID and enrollment changes, expenditures, revenue increases in some cases with ESSER and things like that. So it makes putting all this together in a way that that is in the appropriate context, it makes it very challenging. And I just want to thank you ahead of time, Ms. Moss, for doing that work and leading your team and doing this exceptionally well. So tonight, this is really, like I said, a discussion, and so it provides us that opportunity to discuss the items here. You'll note that that we'll have other opportunities next week and then the 22nd to review and contemplate and ultimately ask the board to adopt a budget. And so with that, just context of a discussion, and if there is other tasks or other information that the board would like, we've had the opportunity to have finance committee meetings. We've had the opportunity to share different information pieces with the board and things like that. And so this is now a kind of a culminating exercise now that we go through to get to the point where we can recommend a budget for adoption. So it's in that spirit, knowing that things continue to some extent become variable, we want to present where we are today. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Moss.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Cavazos, President Mays, trustees. We have a brief preliminary budget presentation for you tonight. As Dr. Cavazos said, we did share this with our board finance committee. We listened to them. They had some input and some recommendations. We've made some adjustments to the presentation to share out with you tonight. We have landed on a preliminary line item. And thank you, Dr. Cavazos, for saying, or mentioning the staff. I do have two of those staff members here tonight with us. I have Sheena Jocelyn, who's our budget director, and Alice Hamrick, who is our executive director of financial services. These ladies have done an outstanding job over the last few weeks. We've spent a lot of time together in conference room B. We've called it the war room. We've worked through lunch. Thanks to Dr. Hill, he's had to bring us lunch in. So we've been doing a lot of work over the last few weeks and to get this information pulled together for you. We will have a budget ready for you to adopt on the 22nd. Tonight, we'll share just a picture of where we are. As Dr. Cavazos said, on the 17th, again, we'll bring a proposed budget. We're required to propose it on the 20th. So, again, we've shared this timeline with you before. Tonight, again, we're discussing the preliminary budget. The board also tonight will authorize for the proposed tax rate and notice of the public hearing. We'll talk about that in another item tonight. The notice is scheduled to post on tomorrow, which is the 11th, in order for us to adopt that budget on the 22nd. So you've seen this chart before. It just shows a picture of our enrollment. Again, enrollment drives our revenue from state funding. There are two large portions. One of it is our state funding, the other is our local funding. And if you'll notice on the chart, 1213 is where Arlington's enrollment peaked at 65,000. I think that's 65,001. Since that time, those enrollment numbers have declined. We all know during the pandemic, we had a significant drop there. All of these things impact the budget. And the biggest drop of all, of course, was during the pandemic of about 2,000 students. The other piece, large piece of our revenue is our property values. That's how we calculate the local portion of it. Our April estimates were in at $36.6 billion. That spot for July estimates is blank. We have not received those yet. We have estimated those. I think we told the board about that back in May. After we received those amounts, we're really looking at that to be around $35 million. Because of the anomaly year that we're having, we have not landed on that number. So you'll see later on in the presentation where we're going to propose. I think I missed a slide. Again, the taxable property value trend is there. I may have missed a slide. Let me see. Yes, I did. I'm looking for my tax rate history. Normally it's in there, but it's not. Okay, so we'll go on to the board-approved funds. These are the ones required by law for the board to approve. We will give you information on all of these funds tonight. We've spoken in the past on just the general operating fund. We'll take a little time with that one tonight, but we'll also introduce the other funds that the board is required to adopt. You are required to approve those at the functional level. This is just a list of the descriptions of those functions. We do not have those dollars at the functional level at this time. We will have them posted on the website on tomorrow, so you can take a look at the dollar amounts attached to that. Again, the budget changes, and we've done some changes as late as 5 o'clock today. So those numbers that you see posted will change, and we'll continue to update them. So the first fund we're going to address is the general operating fund. It's the largest one to be considered by the board, and we'll highlight some of the expenditures and revenues and share some of the historical trends that we have. And also, we'll share some of the variances in those trends that you see. We spent some time on that in our board finance committee. So the highlights, again, we talked about this back in May as well. We're estimating a 5.96% increase in our property taxes, our values, our M&O rate. We have a potential for a reduction to 1.0565. We're proposing to post tomorrow a different rate. Once we get those estimated values in July, we will adjust that, make that adjustment after we get the information from TEA on our MCR. Likely, we will see almost a 3-cent reduction in that. So we're basing our budget on what we're estimating so far. The other item on the revenue side, or that impacts the revenue, is our enrollment. Of course, we've talked about that. I shared the screen with you, or the chart with you earlier. 56,447, a decrease of 300 students. On the expenditure side, we're looking at a decrease of 66 teachers and 8 classroom assistants. Again, as we trend down on enrollment, those teacher counts trend as well, and we do a great job here of controlling that. Our preliminary budget that we share with you tonight will not include a salary increase. We'll give you some estimates on that. You'll see an increase in some of our special program expenses, and some of the items that we've identified to be used with ESSER 3 funding will be removed from the preliminary budget. There's a list there that shows what is not included in the preliminary budget amount. Each % increase of salaries is approximately $4.3 million. We've partnered with TASB. They've recommended some adjustments totaling $3.1 million. Also some stipend adjustments of $3.1 million. And we have new positions that have been identified for next year of $700,000. And then a substitute rate increase that's approximately $735,000. So for the ESSER 3 funding, some of the things that we've identified are on this list totaling 5.6. What we've done is remove these items from the preliminary budget. So on the bottom line, they're not included. We've kind of vetted out these items, and it's not an all-inclusive list of what ESSER will cover, but at this time, we've identified these items that can be removed from the budget. Okay, so I'll pause here. Are there any questions on anything that I've said so far before we go to the next chart?
Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you, President Mays, and thank you, Ms. Moss. On the ESSER 3 funding slide, the previous one. Okay, these were just items, just to be clear, these are just a partial list of items that were already built in, that we were already planning to pay for in the previous budget that you proposed. This isn't, again, not, we're going to be seeing over $100 million worth of funding, which will be going to new programs that Dr. Wirtz will cover. But having said that, this number does appear to be smaller than what I would expected.
And it is. These are just items that were easily accessible at this late in the process. We started our budget process back in January, so all the departments pulled that information together at that time. So we went back to see what we could easily identify, some of the big numbers. It is by no means inclusive of everything that can be covered by ESSER. If we wanted to, we could use all of those ESSER dollars and supplant them on salaries, but we identified these. They were just kind of readily easy for us to access at this point.
And Mr. Wilbanks, and again, this is a discussion, so this helps. Thank you for the question. We don't anticipate taking anything else out of the budget for ESSER for the projected. Is that right, Ms. Moss? This is it? We've identified
Yes, for the preliminary and what we're going to adopt at this time, this is the amount that we're going to pull out for ESSER.
And the reason it without going into the weeds, because Dr. Wertz is going to present, there are other ways to use ESSER funds and all these
Right.
things that we've talked about. We're keeping it true to the purpose as best as possible. And these are budgeted items for next year that we are able to identify and say we can move those to ESSER. You'll hear a whole presentation of all the ESSER dollars and where we're planning and all that. This is simply on the general fund for next year where we could pull some things out that were made sense that we've identified. And I think that's where we are at this point. We're not, I just want to be clear, I don't think there's going to be any more identification of these funds for this next year's budget. ESSER is a whole different story with how we're going to spend that money and all that,
Yeah.
just to be clear.
Thank you for that clarification. And then I just want to make a comment about the slide previous for the benefit of my colleagues. If you could go to the fund highlights, yeah, right there. So on the left-hand side on enrollment, you have the fact that we had a decrease of 300 from the 2020 from the previous year. I do want to point out, I want to thank you for including the chart on page 2, I think it was, 3, that shows the enrollment decline. The key thing to keep in mind going forward in our budget is if you look at the 2019-2020 and look at the loss, that loss is a total of 3,000 students, not 2,000 students. Which will have a significant impact in our budget going forward. Hopefully, post-COVID, we'll see those folks who decided to keep their kids at home during COVID to re-enroll, but that's no guarantee. So that's an important distinction when you look at the budget numbers going forward is on the revenue side, we've got a $3,000 loss on enrollment, which impacts on the revenue.
Yes, you're exactly right on that. The 300 is just based on the number that we ended in 2021 and what we think we're going to lose on top of what we lost during the pandemic.
Oh, and then one other thing, you were looking for your tax rate history. It's in our packet.
Why it's not.
And I guess the bottom line is the proposed is that it's going to remain flat in terms of what we adopt to what it was last year. But of course, if the property values hold true, we'll see a compression of our rate, automatic compression based on the current law.
Yes, you're exactly right, and we'll go over that in the next action item, I believe, as well.
Okay.
The one point, since we went back to the enrollment trend, I want to make just one other point really quickly. We can see how the student enrollment is trending down, and then we can see how our values are going up. What we're doing right now is monitoring that as well, because there's a thing out there in Texas called recapture. And so once those things hit, we will be recapture here in Arlington. We anticipate that won't happen for 2 to 3 years based on how we're trending right now. So if we can get those student numbers up and if that value kind of flattens out, we'll be okay, but it is something that we're monitoring closely for that impact to the budget. Any other questions? Thank you. Okay, so this slide, there are a lot of numbers here. I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights on it. We did share this information with our Board Finance Committee, and we kind of changed that slide up. You'll see on your next page where we changed it up. This one shows our actual 1920 with the without the entry that we had to make based on supplanting ESSER funds. So that was roughly almost $15 million that was supplanted. You'll notice the difference in this slide and the next slide is about $15 million in the 1920 column, where the revenue's 545. The next slide, it'll be lower because it doesn't include the adjustment that we made, and the same thing as far as the expenditures. The difference also is we're comparing actual, so that's where we landed at the end of the year, to our adopted budget for 2021. And then you can see in the yellow, it's yellow column on the right, the preliminary numbers that we're looking at. So we're looking at a bottom line in general operating right now of $10.1 million surplus. And we've included some assumptions there on the bottom so that you can kind of see the trend. It's difficult really to follow the trend because of COVID and other items that have impacted the budget. So that's why we wanted to show you in the two different formats. Let me get back to my notes. Are there any questions on this slide? Okay, this is the same slide. Basically, we inserted the 2021 projection so that you can see the trend as compared to where we're projecting to end in 2021, and you can also compare it to the 21-22 preliminary. And you will note there's a note on the bottom that shows that list of items that we shared earlier are not included in the preliminary number. Question? Okay, I inserted this slide so that you could see some of the items that impact those numbers to where you can't see a trend, or and probably for several years out, we're going to look back at these years where we've been impacted by COVID, where we implemented House Bill 3, where we had the decrease in students. We're going to look back and it's really not going to trend because of all the items that happened during this last 3-year period. So we inserted this slide so you could see just the historical data where our adopted budget and our actuals, and we've trended over the last 4 years of adopting a budget that has a deficit, and we've actually ended the year in the positive. So we're studying this trend right now to see what has caused that. I will point out that if you look at our budget and the size of our budget, it looks like a $32 million turnaround is significant, and it's a large amount, and we need to identify what is causing that. But based on a $500 million budget, that kind of puts it into perspective. The next slide is just a repeat of that slide without the ESSER amount included in it. Any questions on those two slides? Okay, now we'll go over our other funds required to be approved by the board. And we'll start with our food service fund. We've talked about this before in 2021 and that column 2 where we're looking at our projected actual. We're looking at an $8 million deficit due to the pandemic. We've talked before about how our general operating will have to fund that amount for our food service to keep them whole. If you'll look at the preliminary budget for 21-22, we're also looking at a $1.5 million deficit budget for next year. We've already been approved. All students will be able to eat free for breakfast and for lunch next year, so that impacts our revenue in the food service program. So that's why you see that small deficit. Questions on food service?
Dr. Reich.
Thank you, President Mays. So just a clarifier on that number, that 1.7 million deficit, that is not reflected in the current fund balance projections that you just showed us, right?
So the 1.7 that you referred to is just the difference in 2021, the original budget, and,
All right, right.
but the deficit for 21-22 is that 1.5 that you see?
Yeah.
And it's not, are you saying, I'm sorry, repeat your question for me, Dr. Reich.
That's going to have to come out of our general operating budget, hence our fund balance. So is that number already reduced and reflected in the fund balance numbers that you showed us?
It is, and
Okay.
the fund balances are just estimates, let me put that out there.
Sure.
And we don't anticipate, well, we have to calculate it based on our speculation for food services. Mr. Lewis has done an outstanding job this year, even with the difficult challenges that they have faced. And he's always looking for ways to try to prevent that deficit there. So he's come up with some different ways that has helped us this year. So we anticipate he'll do the same for next year. So hopefully we'll come out in the black, but right now that's how it's looking.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll keep going. The natural gas fund is fairly simple there. We get revenue from our oil and gas royalties. We're budgeting just a little bit of a decrease there. We're also budgeting a little bit of a decrease on the interest payments that we receive on that fund. So you'll see a surplus of $657,982. Questions? Keep going. The debt service fund as well, this fund is simply for us to cover all of our abundant debt payments. We've done those calculations. We think that we can leave that INS rate at 0.3007 and still cover all of our payments with the little excess there. Again, we've looked at our interest and reduced that a little bit just because of the timing, and we're looking at a $495,000 surplus. And our next fund is the construction fund. This one looks a little different because on the revenue side of it, we don't put our bond sales in, so that's where you see that deficit. But we actually look at the expenditures and we work with Mr. Horn to see what they're possibly going to be doing during the fiscal year, and we land on that amount. So that $379 million deficit shouldn't be of concern. We'll get another bond. We'll have another bond sale in February. Questions? Okay, and this is just a side-by-side look of all of the budgets that the board is required to adopt, and the excess or deficiency there. Okay, and we land on our budget priorities. This has changed a little bit since you saw it last. We've identified the source for our priorities here, and we've listed them again there for your.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moss. Do we have any additional questions from trustees? Okay. Mr. Wilbanks? I thought you were just smiling at me, huh?
Well, I was, but thank you, President Mays. Ms. Moss, so you listed our budget priorities, and you've got ESSER 3 here. Last week, we had some good news. And the ESSER 2 funds, which were supposed to be sent to us back in December, that the state's been holding on to, finally decided to release those funds. And I believe, well,
59.9 million?
59 point, 9 million, but then supposedly the hold harmless that we were given back in February will be netted out of that. So this is going to leave about 4 million.
We're roughly looking at the whole harmless to be about 15 million.
Yeah.
Could be a little more, a little less.
So I guess my question to you, and the numbers that were, well, none of the ESSER funds are in any of the budgets that's being presented because those are grants that we have to apply for and get, and will net against whatever program we apply for, expenditures we apply for. So we're, in terms of ESSER 3, we haven't included that additional $44 million in any of that planning.
That is correct. The only thing that involves ESSER was the one slide that we identified that we could pull out, and that amount of 5.62 million.
Okay, great. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify, we've got $44 million more coming to us.
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. Mr. Hogg?
Thank you, President Mays, and thank you, Ms. Mawson. I've heard lots of discussions that you're running a very tight budget ship, so I appreciate that. I've also heard you're really pushing the budget to stay to those levels, and sometimes in the past, we maybe had a very, very conservative budget, and I hear you're doing a really good job to get us as close to as point as possible, and I think that's a change because the board has to be aware that in the future, we may not have as much flex on the end of the side from being conservative. So I appreciate that, especially your targeted approach and doing what you're really good at. So I appreciate that. Let me ask this one, and it's a really, I think we're on the brink of a really good budget in really odd times, right? To put that, if you're on that budget priority slide, and I'm a little worried on this budget priority when we say competitive compensation, we're not total compensation. Right? It should be competitive, but it should be total compensation. And we don't have anything, and I'd ask staff to come back to us with what happens with our health insurance, because total compensation is how compensation should be considered. You should not just consider one thing or the other, because people at the end of the day look at your total money in your pocket. And so you've got to consider total compensation with that. And as these new stats have come out for TRS, active care, and the legislature did some good things that we're figuring out. They've got to stabilize their base in their population. People are getting out of DOI, but then they're saying you have the option. I think the district should explore that. I don't think if it's the right option, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't explore that as an option. But then if I look at these increases from where they go, from a range of $31, and our employee-only insurance is not terrible. It's fair from where it comes, and I'm generous to say the word fair. But then, they had a $31 increase, and then you look into the employee and family went up $104, and this is for the lowest premium group that's part of a pretty tight network, and it takes it up to $1,400. If you have your employee and family on there. And then you go down to our high deductible plan. They had a $32 just for employee, or a $107 increase. And so, and not only that, the high deductible plan also went up $200 and $400 additional for the deductible, and their in-network rates went up from 20% to 30%. That's money out of people's pockets, right? Plain and simple, it's money out of their pockets from where it came from. And so with that, I think we have to explore. I think we also as a board have to consider what pieces we have on these budget priorities as total compensation. And I don't know what that is yet. And I don't know where that is. And I'd ask staff to really take that in. And if my colleagues were so willing, I think we put that as part of our total compensation, and then consider all these pieces together, because one thing connects with another. And it's, while you have to individualize them a little bit, you do think you have to take a total look at all of it together. So I would ask for that as we see these new rates coming out. I think it's an 8% increase, which probably not terrible from what we see across the board from what they've done. in what it has, and knowing potential increases as all healthcare is a little concerned over lack of use in 2020 on what their 2021 spend is going to be. There's some risk over that in the future. And so I encourage my board to consider that, but I also encourage us to start thinking not just this budget, of where we're going 4-year, 5-year budget down the road. And I know, Ms. Moss, I heard around town, you're really, and that's what you should be doing. We've got to think when, what happens in 5 years from now on these increases and where these things come from. So that's all I'd ask, is to add that budget priority to our health benefits.
Okay.
And I say
We can
health
identify
benefits,
that.
total benefits.
Mr. Hogg, we did mention that in our board finance committee. We look at benefits as well. When we're pulling numbers for you and we say what is the amount of a 1% salary increase, we look at that, but our team also looks at what is the benefits that are attached to that as well. So we are looking at that information and sharing it with the superintendent and finance committee as well.
Well, it needs to be shared with all of us.
And we
So
will
I'd
do that.
Appreciate it if you come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. I do not see any other questions. I do see a question now. Dr. Reich?
So my question isn't really for you, Ms. Moss. I do say thank you. I echo what Mr. Hogg stated with your efforts of trying to tighten it even more and correct the swing, so to speak. It's already pretty narrow and pretty tight, but the numbers look big, even though percentage-wise on that big budget, it's not. But every bit does help in our decision-making process. So I do appreciate your efforts there and holding people tight as far as that goes. I wanted to say thank you to you, to Dr. Cavazos, and everybody that has been working on these items that have been already included or not included yet into our budget, and that's kind of what I want to put out there to my colleagues, with the exception of the raises, which I think those percentages are things that we have to consider and have more discussion on. We've been given pretty good detail of work from TASB on stipend adjustments and equity adjustments and pay. Those two items, along with the new positions and increasing our substitute compensation, it seems to me that we've been given the data, in my opinion, to support considering having that included in the budget when it comes back to us the next time. But I'm just one. I don't know if that takes a motion. I don't think it takes a motion, but I just want to see if there's congruency amongst the group that we knock that out so that we can have more focused conversations at our next meeting.
Dr. Reich, I would say unless I get different instructions, I don't think that needs to be a motion. I would say probably no additional questions being asked may give you kind of that assumption that you may be asking for.
We will include those things when we bring it back on the 17th.
Okay.
And if I may just clarify, I've heard a couple of comments on the swings in the budget, and we are not just trying to tighten it up. We're more so trying to identify the cause of it, whether it be the vacancies and positions that we're not hiring during the year. So it's not necessarily a tightening that amount, but it's identifying what's causing it and knowing what's causing it so that we can communicate with the superintendent and say, we have these dollars here that are, within the year that we can spend or not, so that he can make informed decisions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moss, for that clarification. Thank you, Dr. Reich, for chairing our Finance Committee and for assisting on working on the board's behalf with Ms. Moss and her team. Ms. Moss, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to you and to your team. Budget may not sound all frou-frou, but my, is it very important to guide the district. I really like the fact that you're not just putting the numbers there, but you're looking behind the numbers, because at the end of the day, we need to know what those numbers represent, which in the end game, it represents our students and it represents our staff. So thank you very much for what you and your staff are doing, and we look forward to hearing from you again at our next meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was sooner than that.
Okay, stay right there. Next on our agenda, items to be withdrawn from the consent agenda. Are there any items to be withdrawn from the consent agenda?
I think there's another action discussion.
Oh, we've got another one.
Don't say so.
My apologies. Okay, our next discussion action item is consider authorization of advertisement of notice of public meeting to discuss budget and proposed tax rate. Dr. Cavazos?
Thank you, President Mays. And this item we bring is a requirement to post our tax rate, proposed tax rate, and in the paper and things like that. And so we have a brief presentation on this item, and we'll keep going. Ms. Moss.
Awesome. Really brief presentation here. You've seen some of these slides before. This is just showing you our current and proposed tax rates. The 2021 actual, total of 1.3871, and the slide just shows you that we're proposing that we don't change that amount when we post it in the paper. Again, we've had discussion on where we think we might land in July when we get those estimates, but we're proposing that we keep it at 1.3871. The required rate comparisons, you'll note on this slide, there's just one difference in that voter approval tax rate, and that rate can be calculated based on what we need to cover our bonded indebtedness, and we can go up to 0.3131. However, we are recommending that we stay at the rate of 0.3007. This is just a picture for you of our appraised and taxable values. It's kind of comparing apples to oranges. It's the July certified for 2020 as compared to the 2021 April certified, as we have not received those July certified numbers yet. And here's our just a little window of our budget and tax rate calendar. Tomorrow, upon your approval, we will post that notice in the paper. The deadline for our district is June the 20th to post the notice, so we're well ahead of that deadline. June 22nd is when we've identified to have our budget hearing and adopt the budget. Of course, we talked about certified values on the 25th. On between July 18th and August 1st is when we submit our information that we've received from certified values to TEA via a district survey. Once we do that, they will calculate our MCR rate, which we've done some preliminary calculations already, and they'll give us an approval for our MCR rate. At that time, we'll make an adjustment to the tax rate and bring it to you to adopt in August. Questions?
Mr. Hogg?
Thank you, President Mays, and thank you again, Ms. Mawson. I fully agree with your proposed rates on that. Let me ask a clarification question of something you briefly mentioned earlier. So, proposing 108 and then proposing the 30.3007 to get us to, in essence, $1.38 is where we're at. But then you're saying there's potential that when we propose it in August, when our rates come back and our values, we come back at $1.05 on that rate, which I think is the safe route to go. In the past, you couldn't really reduce in the past through legislature, and I know there were some problems with that when you went up to TRE. So we're able to do that and reduce from that rate, from that side now?
Yes, sir. We can reduce the rate, we just can't go up on the rate. If we go up on the rate, we have to prepare another notice and put it in the paper, conduct another hearing. So that's why we have taken the safe route of just leaving it where it is, proposing the 1.08, and then before we come to you with a rate to adopt, we'll reduce it based on what TEA's calculations.
And so then if we adopt $1.05 eventually, let's just assume, and I'm making some assumptions, the next year it could be that $1.08 again, correct? That's my clarification.
Well, it depends on values.
Of course.
Whether they increase again, it could be compressed a little more.
And I asked because I know in the past there were some TRE discussions before groups that did that. You couldn't have as much flux. When you did increase, you had to do potentially another TRE to go back to that value. So I'm assuming the legislature fixed that and changed it where you can't have that flux. And then we have full flux on the INS. I know we can change that at any time based on our rates and what we need to pay back values. Okay, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. Mr. Wilbanks?
Just to clarify, Mr. Hogg brought up some good points, but the reason why it might we might go to $1.05 is because of the forced compression.
Yes, that's
Because of
correct.
the rollback, because our property values were higher than 2.5%. So that's why, yes, but since we don't have those certified values now and there's still some uncertainty, it's safer to go out staying the same. And then when they come in and we see that we are going to be compressed, then adopt what will be required. So,
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. Okay, I see no other questions. Do I have a motion? Ms. McMurrow?
I move that the board approve a proposed maintenance and operations tax rate of $1.0864 and a proposed debt service tax rate of $0.3007 to include in the notice of public meeting to discuss budget and proposed tax rate for the 2021 tax year for a total proposed tax rate of $1.3871.
Okay, got a motion. Do I have a second? Okay, I have a motion by Ms. McMurrow, a second by Mrs. Fowler. Any discussion? Seeing none, please vote. All present vote in the affirmative. Motion passes. Thank you very much, Ms. Okay, surprise. Next on our agenda, items to be withdrawn from the consent agenda. Do we have any items to be withdrawn? Okay, I see none. So tonight, we will be considering the items listed on your agenda under consent items. Mrs. Moss, please.
Yes, included in the consent items for your consideration tonight are 6 bids and 2 purchases greater than $50,000. Administration recommends approval of the consent items.
Okay, do I have a motion to accept the consent agenda?
Move for approval.
Do I have a second? I'll second. I have a motion by Mr. Hogg, a second by Mrs. Fowler. Any discussion? Seeing none, please vote. All present vote in the affirmative. The consent agenda passes.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Mrs. Moss. We now move to our discussion item, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief 3, ESSER 3 Fund Plan Update. Dr. Cavazos.
Thank you, President Mays. And so we bring this ESSER update as we brought in the previous board meetings and kind of where we are in the process. So if there was any complication to this budget consideration, this is it. And it's not Dr. Wertz that's complicating it, it's ESSER that's complicating it. It is really complicated. It's being released, there are rules being written, and it ultimately is an application. It ultimately goes for approval from the state. And it's an interdependent series of strategies to accomplish really, to make it simple, 3 things, right? One is what effect did we have as a result of COVID during COVID? What after COVID in terms of student recovery and interventions? And if that wasn't enough, what issues or considerations we had before the pandemic? So these funds are used in that context, the before, during, and after the pandemic. And I want to thank Dr. Wertz and his team for diligently working on this, as this is something that is really new, and it's an infusion of money, but it's also an infusion of challenge. So thank you, Dr. Wertz and your team, for leading this effort. It has not been alone, and he'll tell you that. He's had much input from a lot of different people, including stakeholders that you'll hear about tonight. But this is also a discussion item. And this is also where, as we make progress, will be, our goal is the 17th, another update, and then the 22nd, bring for board adoption the plan, if you will, for ESSER funding. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Wertz, and he can take us through where we are thus far.
Okay.
Dr. Wertz.
Good evening, President Mays, members of the board, Dr. Cavazos. Thank you for letting me be here this evening to share with you an update about where we are in our planning for ESSER 3 funds. As Dr. Cavazos mentioned, and you know better than anybody else, when you have this infusion of funding in such a short period of time, there is some complication, interdependency between the different funding sources. So we're trying our best to splice those out, find the best way to maximize resources in order to make an impact on kids here in our system. I thought what I would do first of all is do a quick review of some of this information you received to date, just in case there's audience members who might need to understand some of our boundaries. So the first thing here is spending requirements. There is a requirement around ESSER spending that Dr. Cavazos alluded to in his opening statement, which is really around money that's used to close gaps. So there is a requirement that a minimum of 20% of the ESSER $3 be based on interventions or other kinds of programming that's designed to close instructional learning gaps that students may have had generated during the COVID-19 crisis. This money can be used to provide interventions to students to close not only academic gaps, but also to address some of their social and emotional needs, and any gaps that might be evident among disproportionately evident among specific student groups or populations. There are some expenditures that are not allowable, and those include those that are listed here, and I won't go through them in detail because we did the last time that I shared an update. But in essence, some of the information that you can see in here are related to bonuses and merit pay and debt service. Those are items that cannot be supplanted and used for ESSER funding. Those still have to stay in the same budgets that they normally sit in. And this is a quick summary of some of the allowable expenditures that a district can choose to spend the money on. You can use it to provide professional development. You can use it to pay for the Reading Academy training that's required by law here in Texas. You could use it to integrate technology into the classroom. You can use it for staffing. You can use it for class size reduction teachers, or for coaching, or for leadership development. And then of course you can use it for all those mental health and therapeutic services that we are offering now, or we may choose to offer in the future. It's also designed to provide us with resource money to fund resources in terms of instructional materials. And we can also use it to do other things like enhance facilities or to make some updates to our infrastructure if that's necessary. As we've been working through the process of planning for our use of ESSER 3 funds, we really focused our efforts around 4 primary challenges. The first one is gap in outcomes that kids may be experiencing in their learning. The second one is really around making sure that our students have the supports and their parents have the supports and resources available to help really address some of the social and emotional challenges that have been generated since the pandemic began. We're also looking at equity, and when I say equity, we're really talking about making sure that all of our students in the system have access across the system to the same quality level of learning experiences and resources to address any gaps in their academic achievement and or their social emotional well-being, and that we are cognizant about where additional resources may need to be placed in not necessarily have it be a one-size-fits-all. Sometimes when you receive a large infusion of money, people tend to think everyone gets the same amount, and what we want to do is really look to see where needs are and to drive those funding sources to where the greatest needs are so that all kids have access to the things that they need. And then the last but not least, or least important, is sustainability. What we're really looking to do is use the money to enhance the learning and close the gaps in the system without creating a scenario where you kind of fall off a cliff in the end of 3 years. And so we're trying to be very cognizant of how do you really infuse the system and build capacity, but not create it in such a way where you're actually going to have to stop and undo a lot of things in 3 years from now when the money is no longer there. So we really focused our learning around these 6 guiding principles, really sticking to ensuring that the instructional programming provides our students with grade level content and really focus around the rigor within the grade level bands that students find themselves in. What we're going to try not to do is spend a bunch of time really remediating or going back into previous grade levels. We're trying to accelerate learning, and I talked about that in one of our previous meetings where we're really going to provide students with access to the standards that they're being taught in their current grade level and leverage our assessment process to understand where they are in that learning continuum so that we can go back and reinforce or reteach concepts that what I call our big rocks so they can move forward in the curriculum without having to go way back. The other thing that we're really focusing on is making sure we're going deep in our instruction, that we're not necessarily just trying to get through it with a specific pace. We do have a pacing guide, and I emphasized this last time. It's not a free one for all. Every kind of teacher does whatever they want. That we do need to make sure kids get through their curriculum and they're prepared for the next course, but we do want to make sure there's enough space in there for teachers to customize learning and the pace of learning for the groups of students that are in their class, knowing that the volume of kids that are going to be behind are probably going to be more significant than we usually experience. We're also going to be working on prioritizing the content and the learning. So standards, really elevating which standards are the big rocks that kids need to have access to be successful in the next course or grade level. Making sure that we're really focused on including all learners. That gets back to that equity concept I was talking about earlier. And then finally, making sure that we are really trying to understand where students' learning gaps are, and then we're not overemphasizing results that come from one single standardized test. We really want to make sure that we're doing what we call triangulation or a 360 review of students to understand really where their learning gaps may be, and that we're not really just looking at how they performed on one assessment given on one day within a 3-hour or 4-hour time period. And then finally, really try to think about the commonalities that all of the experiences that we've all had together. You know, one of the things we really want to focus on in our students' learning experience is we want them to have access to learning that's relevant, things that actually mean something to them as a person. Well, we've all gone through these experiences together, and you can leverage these things to help us learn in the classroom. And so we want to build on the common things that kids have experiences with each other in the classroom as a foundation for their learning experience. When we think about sustainability, this is a really significant priority, and you'll hear us talk about this again and again, probably as we get closer and closer to the specifics of the actual plan and where we want to target the money being spent. These are the 6 essential questions that I mentioned last time we were here, and I thought I would just re-emphasize them again. We're really trying to think about how any investment that we're currently about to make with ESSER dollars, how that addresses current and long-term needs of our students. So not just trying to fill a quick gap, but also try to think about how can we extend and use the money to leverage learning that could go on for years past the money. Also, how does it advance the priorities that have been established by the board in the strategic plan, our instructional priorities as a district, and our vision and our goal that all of our kids graduate exceptionally prepared. What we're not trying to do is what I call take a sharp right turn. We already know and believe the things that we're doing are research-based. What we want to do is accelerate those things in ways we couldn't do before because now the funding actually exists. We also want to make sure that we know that the strategies we put in place, that we have some sense about their efficacy. What we don't want to do is spend money and then find out later on down the road that it wasn't a good strategy. We want to have some sense that the strategies that we're using actually will yield a result. And in doing that, we have intentions on making sure that we find strong measures so that we can track our what I call return on investment as we move along the road so that we can know when it's important to discontinue or make an adjustment to our plan. And then we also want to make sure that we are equitably and effectively really trying to implement strategies across the system, meaning not just put strategies out there and fund them, but ensure that what's happening in the classroom is as designed. And I kind of talk about this in terms of like best practices or coaching. We want to make sure that not only do teachers get trained and supported in best practice, we want to make sure that's actually translating into practice in the classroom. And that really is just a simple example, but we want that really on all of our strategies. Whatever strategy we put in place, we want to make sure that's being done with fidelity. That way we can measure whether it's having an impact or not, or whether a change needs to happen. And then finally, how do we build on the district's capacity when the funding is ended? That's a big question we're having in the back of our minds the entire time. And we want to make sure that we can measure our success and know how to perpetuate it once the funding goes away. So these are the targets that we're using to really drive some of our goal setting. I want to acknowledge on the front side that these are targets that are at the state level. They are STAR scores, and with the exception of kindergarten readiness. CCMAR is not a STAR score, but it does go into accountability in terms of rating. The reason why we felt like CCMAR was an important one is because there's a lot more to school than just the 4 core content areas, and 40% of how high schools, for example, are rated come from kids' access to these various programs, and typically they are the things that keep kids in school. So what we want to do is measure how kids are progressing through those programs. While I'm mentioning the STAR results for 3rd and 8th reading and math and English 1 and 2 and algebra, I don't want to underscore the importance of our screener data and our curriculum assessments and that kind of information that we will be using as micro targets to understand how we're progressing towards these larger ones. The reason these are kind of put out there in a large way is simply because they are the state accountability system for which we are all held accountable. But we do believe that the real meat of where you make differences for kids is in those assessments that kind of lead up to this point in terms of understanding where kids are along the way. So this is just an outline of our map, of our process. You've already seen this before, but I wanted to articulate kind of where we are, which is right here in the middle, between May and June, so to speak, or right in the June area. What we're trying to do really is understand what the stakeholders' thoughts are about some of the things that we want to put in place. And so we are right in the middle of that. We will be presenting at the chamber. We have solicited information through a survey to all of our teachers, staff. Our students have access to it, and the community. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But we're still in the process of gathering information from our stakeholders. Once that's finished and we finalize their review to make sure we're aligned to some of the things that the community is offering us in terms of feedback, then we'll finalize our plan and then bring that in the future, like Dr. Cavazos had mentioned. There are specific planning categories in the way that we're aligning the plan as we're designing it. The first one are the three major ones that Dr. Cavazos mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Funding that's directed towards a safe reopening of schools, enhancing services that are already in place, and also needs that existed in our system prior to the COVID-19 crisis. Within those three large buckets, we have broken those priorities down into the three areas that we're really focusing on in terms of strategic plan work that's still there, and what we probably will have some of that move into the next one. The learner experience, a development of leadership in terms of all the pathway work that we've been doing, and then our focus around equity. So the best way I can describe the way we're organizing it is you have these three big buckets, and within those buckets there are many strategies. We have stratified those now also by the specific three categories within the strategic plan, and then within the strategic plan categories there are all the individual buckets, and these buckets are professional development, staffing, mental health and behavioral supports, instructional materials, extended day and summer programming, facilities, and technology. So in essence, when you finally get to the place where you get to see the plan, you'll see dollars attached to these large three buckets, but within those dollars, they're all broken down and stratified by these individual categories that are kind of more minute or more practical in terms of application in the day-to-day kind of school district life. Now, I mentioned earlier that we were soliciting feedback from our stakeholders, and this is just a quick slide to articulate who we've already heard from and who we're in the middle of hearing from. So we've already received and gathered feedback from a cross-departmental team that was established to kind of set the direction. We've solicited feedback from principals, from teachers, from the FFC, the Financial Futures Committee. And then we also established a survey that we put online, and it was also as a pop-up on our website. So if you ever went to the website, the first thing you would see was this pop-up, which would invite you to participate in the survey. That closed today. As of about 1:30 today, we had 4,979 respondents to that survey. It really covered every category. So we've had over 1,600 staff members respond, 275 community members. We had about 290 district staff, 2,600 or more parents, and then we had 141 students that actually responded as well. And all the categories that were required by law to receive feedback from, we received feedback from every single one of those categories. So we are in compliance with with state statute. We will go to the Chamber of Commerce and also solicit feedback from that group, and then we have information from our departments that we're going to solicit. Once that information is gathered, then we will then assimilate all of the information together, compare it against some of our strategies we thought about, and make some adjustments. I wanted to highlight on this slide the specific categories that we're looking for feedback from, and as I mentioned, we received one from all of them, which is actually I'm very excited about that, because you put a survey out, but you're not always sure who's going to be responding, and we've had a really good response in our system, which has been nice. When we really focused on the feedback, if you all saw the survey, there were specific questions that we asked, and we were really trying to help us prioritize some of our thinking, because there are many things you can spend money on, and many districts are spending money on the same things. We wanted to know what our system believed where they thought their priorities would be. So we asked questions around what parents or community members thought were the most important priorities in terms of their students experiencing academic success in the classroom. We want to know what they believe were the strongest priorities in terms of ensuring their kids and their families had resources to support their emotional and mental well-being. We also asked questions about technology, hardware, and also access to the internet or Wi-Fi. And then we also had a few other questions, or 2 questions that we intentionally left open-ended to give people an opportunity to give us feedback around things that we may not even be thinking about. And so those were all included inside the survey. As a preliminary focus, I wanted to give you some examples of some sample strategies that we know are going to take up dollars from ESSER 3, and also re-emphasize this concept around sustainability. On this slide, you're going to notice that some things are sustainable for a long period of time, and some things are sustainable only in the period of ESSER. And that's just a really important point that we're trying to really focus on, is all of these things that you're seeing on this slide in front of you, for example, instructional coaches, counselors, extended time that give more PLC opportunities to teachers in the elementary grades, more resources and exemplar lessons in the curriculum. All those things are great, and they're all necessary. Right now, those additional things can be funded with ESSER, but they're not necessarily sitting in the general operating budget for the future. So what we've been discussing is how do we leverage both of those funds to try to extend things as much as possible. The purpose of this slide only is to give examples to not only the board, but also the public about some things. The fact that this is a funding source that is finite and it does end. It's basically like an infusion. It comes and it goes. We do have some that we believe that we can hopefully move on past the 3 years, but it's going to take some strategy to do that. In order to really think about the ESSER 3 roles, because we know that there is an end, we will be very intentional about making sure that we define clearly for any new positions that are funded with ESSER 3 what their specific role is going to be. So for example, all the roles that we define out of ESSER 3 will be intended to be supporting roles. So we will articulate very clearly for the applicants upfront that their position is time bound, and that they will have specific functions that will be trying to accomplish in the period that they're employed. We will also be wrapping district support teams. So if we hire, for example, a new position at the campus level, we will ensure that there are people at the district level that are going to be supporting and developing that position, that they're not just kind of being hired and they're all kind of working out on their own at the campus. We want to make sure there's a support structure, and that we put professional learning and role development in place. Because, for example, if we are hiring a literacy coach, we want to make sure those literacy coaches understand deeply what literacy instruction is supposed to look like, and also that they have the skills for coaching. And then finally, we want to hold ourselves accountable and make sure that we have measurable return on investment on the dollars that we spend towards new positions. We don't want to just have a bunch of new positions without knowing that they're in fact impacting kids. While we're talking about dollars here connected to positions, the point that I really wanted to emphasize tonight is that we're really focused on building capacity. That's really where we want to try to spend as much of our money as possible. Positions come, positions go, but what we really want to do is try to really infuse the system with as much professional learning and growth and development as we can, so that when the staff that's here now is still here 3 years from now, they have been poured into, because we have now the time and the energy and the ability to do it with the funding that's there. The last part I wanted to just mention today is this relationship between ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, and I know that was brought up a few minutes ago in Ms. Moss's presentation. ESSER 2 is approximately $60 million total, and really that money is being designated specifically to help stabilize enrollment that's been impacted because of COVID-19. So when we think about ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, those funding sources are really being dedicated towards different kind of concepts. One is more about stabilization of enrollment, whereas ESSER 3 is really about infusing the system with dollars to close gaps and to help students overcome some of the challenges that they have been going through since the COVID-19 started. So as Dr. Cavazos mentioned, we'll be back on June 22nd. I suspect probably June 17th with another update, and then June 22nd with some more granular details about the monies and where they're specifically going to go in terms of those categories that I mentioned. Any questions that I can answer for you?
Thank you very much, Dr. Wertz. Do I have any trustees with questions? Yes. Ms. McMurray?
Thank you so much for all the work and thought, and that goes for the committee too, that you guys are pouring into this. It's a great problem to have. How are we going to allocate all of these funds? I do have a question about the survey, which I know that you know, a lot of school districts are putting surveys out there to get community input on ESSER funds. And, you know, when we compare ourselves to our neighbors, we have a little bit more, you know, than surrounding districts. And I'm curious because I took the survey as a parent, and I noticed that it was very brief, very clear. I liked the survey a lot. At the top, like you said, it does ask you what type of stakeholder you are, and you can check more than one box. When you guys review the findings on the survey, will there be a way to isolate teacher input? Will you guys be able to look at what the teachers say?
Yes, we can actually isolate each of the groups and the grade levels. So I'll be able to tell, for example, if it's a parent, what grade level bands their kids are in. I'll be able to know if it's in fact, I have some of that preliminary data I was looking at earlier today. I'll be able to know whether you have a student in the system at all or whether you're just providing feedback. And I'll know, for example, if you are a teacher or a parent, which grade level bands you're actually trying to impact. If you remember from the survey, we did elementary, junior high, and high school, so there's chunks. I won't be able to get down to like a first grader per se, but I can tell where the feedback's coming from in terms of which bands they're in.
That's wonderful. And I was elated to see curriculum resources on your list here. And I would argue that, you know, these curriculum resources, depending on what they are, they can go beyond 3 years of sustainability as long as they're aligned to our standards and as long as there's a rich bank of resources for our teachers when they get into Curriculum Central. That can be beyond 3 years of sustainability. And, you know, that hits gaps in student learning, equity, students' re-engagement, sustainability. If we beef up the resources for our teachers, that addresses all 4 of those challenges. So I really am hopeful that that's one of the avenues that we take. And, you know, professional development, the Reading Academy, our fairly new language arts standards from the state, all of these, to me, are even more reason to, you know, beef up those resources so that our teachers can have the proper tools to teach.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Ms. McMorran. Do I have any other trustees with any questions? Dr. Reich?
Thank you, President Mays. Thank you for all the information. Looking forward to the plan. Specifically, we have talked about accountability and metrics and specifically what you said as far as being able to measure that return on the investment. Can you give us kind of an idea of what that ROI is potentially or looks like and how different that may be than what we're already trying to do at our individual campuses regarding whether it's STAR or whatever?
Well, it really depends on the strategy that's being used because what we've been focusing on is process measures and outcome measures. And so when it comes to return on investment, what we'll have to look at specifically is what's the strategy that we're trying to implement, and there are going to be many. Specifically, what's the process look like when we're trying to measure it? So I'll give you a quick example, like coaching. We will enhance our coaching of teachers, specifically in the areas of reading and math. But in order to determine ROI specifically on coaching, what we're going to have to look at is not only the dollars that we're actually attaching to the coaching process, but also how many teachers are actually receiving their coaching touch points, how many teachers are able to grow and develop in terms of the actual best practices that they're implementing, and then do we see those things in practice in the classroom, and what's the relationship between that and the scores that students are actually producing either on a screener or on STAR. When I can marry that by leveraging Dr. Barlow's department through a formula, I'll be able to know whether there's a return on investment and if there's an actual impact that one process is having on the outcome. What I don't want to do is create a scenario where we're making judgments. Like, for example, I can make a very simple judgment of, oh, we infused the system with coaches, my scores got better for students, that must mean it was coaching. But we know that that's actually not the case. There are lots of things that impact a score. What we want to do is figure out some way, whether it's through a regression model or something, know exactly what was the actual impact level that each of these strategies are having on a specific outcome so that we can discontinue the ones that aren't. So to answer your question, it's a little more complicated. I don't have one number that's a return on investment. What we'll do is we'll set our target goals, and then we'll look at our strategies, and then we'll measure the impact those strategies are having on the targets based on how well they're being implemented in the classroom. And that's why it's kind of complex. One thing I can say about this whole plan is the state's given us flexibility to apply for the grant, start the process, and then revise, keep moving. So it's gonna take us some time to really hone in on the measures once we solidify what the actual expenditures are going to be. But we are trying to be really committed to understanding whether it's making a difference or not, because we feel responsible to do something with this money, since it's probably a once-in-a-lifetime infusion that we'll probably never see again.
So for the plan that we will see, it will have those outcomes, the desired outcomes and the metrics associated with that
You'll
for
have
ROI?
you'll have the targets. You probably won't have all the individual measures for each of the strategies by the 22nd. That
Okay,
will come
that's
down
what I
the
was,
road. Yeah.
okay. But it will come, we will see that.
We will have
because,
those, yes.
I mean, for me, in business, you don't move forward unless you start with that outcome in mind and
Right.
you assess what that ROI is, and then you launch.
Right.
And then you measure if you're getting there or not to scrap a program or keep moving. So I just want to make sure that we're looking at that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Reich. I just have to say, as Dr. Reich was asking the question, you were answering it. I pictured you as that person on this slide that's under the rock. Heavy lift, this really is. Mr. Chapa. Press it one more time. There you go.
Thank you, President Mays. Dr. Wertz, I don't have really any questions, but I just wanted to follow up on a point that was on one of your slides for looking at sustainability and some of the things we're looking for the ESSER funds to do going forward. And I was really glad to see that a pre-K expansion is part of that plan. You know, we've not known for a long time the real benefits of early childhood education. And we have, in the last few years, I think, really grown capacity in that area through HB3, through the 2019 bond. We're doing a lot of investment in our facilities for early childhood. And so when you come back with a more granular plan, something I'm really hoping to see, and this just may be a personal thing of mine, but I would really like us to see or to use these ESSER funds as a way to think bold and ambitiously about how we can take advantage of our capacity building in the early childhood area and come up with a plan for, I don't want to use the term universal pre-K, because I don't know if that's feasible, but to really, the expansion to be a significant one, because I know that, in a district that's 75% economically disadvantaged, our students are going to be some of the students to most substantively benefit from quality early childhood education. And I read an article just a couple of weeks ago about how COVID has impacted early childhood education providers in a very negative way, and they're struggling to find quality staff to staff their facilities. And so I think this is a real opportunity for us to step into that area to provide a pipeline of very high quality early childhood education in Arlington, in West Grand Prairie. So that's something that I hope to see in the plan when it comes back, and would really encourage you and your staff to build that out.
Okay. If I could add just context that, thank you, Mr. Chapa, that's why it's on the pre-K expansion, it's a critical part. One thing that makes it challenging, that's why we keep expansion in there, is because this will also require some facilities, because we don't have necessarily the pre-K classrooms. We may have classrooms, but they may not have the bathrooms and the standards that we've already set through the bond. And then if some buildings don't have space, it may require some facility improvement. This funding can be used for some of that, but it then becomes, to what extent can we use it, or do we want to use it for that? So we're running that analysis. It would likely include more teachers for pre-K and things like that. But it is absolutely one of those goals that we're working hard to try to accomplish, because it has a big return. We know that, built-in or big return, as you mentioned, Mr. Chapa. And we know that our bond with the full-day pre-K and the standard of pre-K classrooms really has elevated that, and the resources in those pre-K classrooms. But that's a standard we would keep applying, and that analysis, we have to be mindful of classroom space and things like that, but absolutely a goal to have that.
Thank you, Dr. Cavazos. Thank you, Mr. Chapa. Mr. Wilbanks.
Thank you, President Mays. And I'm glad to see, like Mr. Chapa, that we're really focusing on those high yield strategies that we know really move the needle in terms of student outcome, like the pre-K expansion. I'm also excited to see that and seeing this tremendous amount of money maybe being the catalyst for us to do something that we've all had, I think most members on this board and previous boards have wanted us to move into. So we know it moves the needle. And, I know some of these other kind of big rocks, kind of the big buckets that you have tend to be high yield. One thing that I know is, according to the research, is very high yield is high dosage tutoring. And I'm surprised that what didn't make your cut of kind of the big rocks here.
This is not an exhaustive list. This was just a sample. So my intention was just to help. The actual intention behind this slide was really less to highlight any kind of big rocks. It was really more intended to help everyone understand that there's an end to the funds and that some initiatives start and go on forever and some ends start and end. That was really the intention. Tutoring is in our plan. I just wasn't creating the intention
Specifically high dosage tutoring? Meaning 3 times a week or up to 50 hours.
I wasn't familiar with the term high dosage, so thank you.
Well, if you look at, there's several Harvard studies.
Right, so tutoring is in the plan, and we're talking specifically about how to make sure that students get access to tutoring that's actually research-based. And the reason I say that is because one of the mistakes that's been made around tutoring that does not yield is when kids are, I'll just use a very rough example. They stay after school, they work with the teacher, but the teacher doesn't necessarily have a plan that's mapped out specifically around their actual needs, and that there is, to your point, what we call time and treatment. There's not a specific amount of time for a specific duration for a specific period, number of days, so to speak. That is what's required to make tutoring successful. We have a department that's overseeing that, and that's being considered. The dollars that you're going to see in here is around how much money is being set aside to pay for instructors to actually deliver the actual tutoring. What it isn't necessarily is just a package. So that's the reason why you don't see it on that slide. Like I said, the purpose of the slide was really not to list the strategies per se, but more to give you a sense that some of the items are going to come and some of them are going to go. Because I think there might be some, not with the board per se, but just in general with the public, people may not necessarily realize that the hiring of staff has to be sustainable if you want to really make a dent in the system. And so that was the intent behind that slide.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I noticed you also included as an example extended PLC time for elementary. And I think I'm not as familiar with the evidence behind that, but I assume that's going to give teachers free time to really try and, as you said earlier, get that 360 view of the student and where their gaps are and triangulate. And also, I know one of the best practices for addressing the learning loss is for teachers to collaborate with prior year teachers who might have known that exactly where those gaps are going to, and so I assume that'll allow teachers to collaborate more broadly, which will be a good thing, and has been proven to be quite effective at addressing the learning loss. I, like Dr. Reich, was glad to see that. I think you're going to be very KPI focused on your academic targets and measures, and I think you've addressed it, but I think that the KPIs at Reading Where we at addressing the academic targets you've outlined are going to be essential, and I hope the board would have visibility to those. I know you're utilizing not just the STAR, but the screeners to kind of get that progression to where we are in terms of progressing to those goals. Do you have anything in addition? I mean, can you elaborate a little more in terms of how often you're going to be checking and what the specific KPIs you're going to be looking at in both reading and math, as well as for the CCMR?
So when it comes to reading and math, the screeners are given at a beginning, middle, and end of year. And so we can measure concretely when at those 3 points in terms of like how students are progressing. Some students participate on a monthly basis depending on where they are in their continuum of learning. So we can go in and actually see how kids are progressing as a system. But the actual targeted dates are usually we take a baseline at the beginning, we see where they are in the middle of the year, and we see where they are at the end of the year. And we compare that progression towards STAR outcomes. I suspect that we're probably going to have, as a team, we'll probably review where we are in terms of our strategy implementation, how that is impacting the classroom on a quarterly basis. In terms of reporting out to the public, it'd probably be more like once a semester, just because you have to really get through learning. Sometimes I think there's a mistake of over-reporting, and it takes kids time to learn. You have to give people time to get through it. So that's probably what we'll probably recommend is once every semester. In terms of the actual things we're going to use to measure student progress, they're the things that I mentioned earlier, including curriculum assessments, which we've done a lot of research on our curriculum assessments. They're very predictable, and they are aligned to the standards. Kids that perform on the curriculum assessments, we can pretty much tell where they're going to land when it comes to those standards on STAR. It's been pretty tight with our system. So those are the ones we're probably going to primarily use in terms of at the system level. Now, keep in mind, there are summative and formative assessments, and teachers will use so many different kinds of things to track their students' progress, including running records and reading and guided reading. We are going to encourage and train and support teachers in all of that, but we're going to leave that to the classroom teacher. We're not going to try to micromanage classroom teachers in that way, but we do want to try to elevate some of the system level data just to understand how we need to adjust and what kind of resources to provide teachers along the way.
So I guess a follow-up question to that is, one of the important questions or answers we need is just how big the learning loss is. And I think our first snapshot of that will be the STAR results that are coming out this
I would say
summer.
a pretty stable snapshot would be that. We've talked about this. We had a very decent volume of students take STAR, even though staying at home that came to take STAR. And I think again, unknown, first time during the pandemic, if they would come take STAR. And so we do feel like we'll have a volume enough to be able to make some real assessment of learning loss, performance predictions, and things like that, that quite frankly will be helpful, because at the end of the day, like it or not, that's the real target for next year as well, right? The STAR results at the end of next year. So the good news is we had a volume of students, and this wasn't like they took it at home, so who took the test and all that, they had to come to school. So we have a good volume of students that took the test and should, as we get results, be able to really pinpoint some of those gaps, loss, call it what we want, and that's a whole body of analysis that Dr. Barlow will work on as well with his team. To have some data, as you mentioned, to really begin to point in the direction of where the intervention needs to happen and at what level and at what school and what grade level and things like that.
So when do you anticipate the board can be briefed on what those results tell us in terms of what the learning loss is?
So we get them periodically through the rest of June, the results. They're not, we don't have the results yet. We're getting the results. So a good target would be the beginning of August in terms of a briefing. That's not our target for an analysis, but in terms of board meetings, that's when there'll probably be a better, healthier briefing, because keep in mind, there's a lot to this, and maybe Dr. Barlow wants to address this, maybe he doesn't, but there's a lot that goes into reporting that we get and the frequency and how they're gonna analyze the scores, and then we put it through our system to make sure we have good assessment data and things like that. It's not as simple as getting a roster of student performance. So it will take some time, but that's it's traditional. Say again.
I said assessments are still being taken.
In the summer.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So I would say August, like traditionally, but the good news is that we will have a volume of students that took this test that will be able to really, quite frankly, make some good assessment of where we are, where before, again, a lot of these things have continued to change. Before, it was kind of intuitive that we may struggle, not just us, but districts, because not that many kids would take STAR, and so how are you gonna know, and things like that. A lot of them did, so that's the good news.
You know, on the one hand, I'm glad they did. I wasn't like you. I wasn't expecting it. I was worried that we wouldn't have a good pre-assessment of where we stood in terms of the learning loss before we started these interventions. But it's key to know where we're starting out. But I also hate that it's just a single test we're relying on, and not that triangulation that Dr. Wirtz spoke of earlier. I would encourage you guys, if the Finance and Academics Committee could be briefed as soon as possible, as soon as we start getting some of the preliminary data, or kind of a rough gauge, knowing that it'll come into clearer focus as we do more analysis, but the sooner that we can be briefed, the better.
Sure, I think that makes sense. The kind of conclusions we reach, we really have to be mindful that it does take the process of data collection and analysis before we get a lot of preliminary data, and I just caution that the preliminary data is one picture that always continues to change until we stabilize it, but absolutely we'll go to the committee and provide that. It may be August to the committee as well.
And again, thanks for all the work that's going into this. As Dr. Cavazos can tell you, I'm kind of the impatient one on the board, and I'm anxious to hear exactly what our strategy is going to be. I know there's quite a number of high-yield strategies that some of the other districts have already announced or will be announcing, and that are backed by a lot of research, and I anticipate we'll be doing a lot of some of the similar things. But I do, again, commend you guys for starting first and putting the priority on sustainability, and what are the strategies like the pre-K expansion that would be highly sustainable going forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. Mrs. Fowler?
President Mays, Dr. Wirtz, this information is incredible. I thank you and your team so much for all of this and providing this for us. You know, this really, if we look at it in a positive sense, this really could be an exciting time for AISD with all these funds coming in. It finally gives us an opportunity to maybe do some things that we haven't had the money for, or to try some things that we didn't know if we could fund it or not. So if you look at it positively, you know, this is a time to really be able to try some new things and ways to fill in those gaps. And coming off of about a year and a half that the district and everyone across the nation has had to face, having these funds and knowing that there's some hope and that we will be able to catch the students up and do things like the social, emotional learning and gaps in their learning. So we need to look at this really as a blessing and try to figure out the best ways to use all of this money, because it's probably a one-time thing. So we need to plan it out and make sure that we use the money in the best way. But thank you so much for all of this. I appreciate it.
Thank you, I agree with you totally.
Thank you, Mrs. Fowler. And I think that kind of sums up what I wanted to end with saying is, really, I agree with you. In that picture, you're under that rock and we think you're just scared, but you're really going, yes! So that's the positive out of all of this. And to say, what I'm really impressed with as a governing body is knowing that a lot of the words that were used tonight, implementing with fidelity, your micro-targets, the different strategies to use for our students, those are things that we get out of your reports on a regular basis. So I am very happy to know that we're in a district who has already been looking at these things and implementing them in the way that we could. And now that we're in a situation where we can do it even bigger and better and for a specific cause, and you've already pivoted on that. I mean, it wasn't like you've had the last 19 months to figure all this out, you and or your staff or anyone sitting over here. This is something that y'all immediately turned around, pivoted on, started with that outcome. What are the outcomes we need to see, and here's what we can do. So for that, I appreciate that, and I think that the students and the staff and the community of AISD will really appreciate that as well. So thank you. You're excused. Thank you, Dr. Wertz. Okay, next on the agenda is our open forum for non-agenda items. Mrs. Benjamin, do we have any requesters registered to address the board regarding non-agenda items?
Yes, ma'am. We have Mr. Jesus Mendoza. He was registered to speak at the last meeting, but was not available when we got to that portion. He's the one that provided the handout on electrohypersensitivity, and he is available to speak tonight.
Okay. Is he physically present? Okay. Mr. Mendoza?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here. Could you please tell me when to start?
I sure can. You can start right now.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jesus Mendoza, and I have been homebound for more than 10 years with life-threatening electrosensitivity EHS, which is caused and aggravated by exposure to the same wireless microwave radiation reaching children and teachers at school. I have been violently ill several times. I'm sleep deprived and in pain all the time. Every day is a different torture. This is a horrible way to die. My EHS has been recognized by federal and state agencies and by courts as a physical medical condition and as a disability. EHS proves conclusively that exposure to levels of radiation below the federal safety limits causes severe harm and disabilities, and that exposing children to microwave radiation defeats the purpose of education. It is estimated that without knowing it, more than 50% of the population is already suffering symptoms of EHS. Children, teachers, doctors, attorneys, and even a director of the World Health Organization are suffering from EHS. Please see wearetheevidence.org. Despite that electrosensitivity is reaching pandemic proportions, most doctors are in the dark or in denial and continue misdiagnosing and mistreating with harmful drugs and invasive procedures symptoms that disappear with just reducing exposure to microradiation. A law firm filed a federal lawsuit with evidence of how cell phones used by our children emit more than 5 times the levels allowed by federal law, when eventual doses of radiation above the federal safety limits cause harm even to healthy and strong adults. And 7 law firms are warning school officials of the potential civil and criminal liability to exposing children unnecessarily to harmful microwave and 5G radiation when an expensive hardwired broadband internet is readily available. Some of the symptoms of EHS include pain, swelling of vital organs, swelling of face, head and eyes, symptoms of heart attack and stroke, rashes and loss of skin, flu and allergy symptoms, stomach and digestive troubles, insomnia, vision, hearing, memory, speech, concentration, and breathing problems. Childhood cancer, miscarriages, and birth defects. Scientific studies prove most doctors are confounding the symptoms of electrosensitivity with symptoms of other illnesses, including autism, ADHD, dyslexia, PTSD, heart attack, stroke, multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, hypothyroidism, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue syndrome, diabetes, and major depression and suicidal tendencies, as detailed on the request to protect the children submitted to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona, and posted on the case materials of J. Mendoza at wirelesswatchblog.org. Ladies and gentlemen, your prompt response to this evidence can save the lives of children and teachers and other defenseless and suspected victims. Thank you very much for giving serious consideration to this matter. I respectfully request the superintendent to provide a copy of this comment to the president and members of the Board of Trustees, to principals, teachers, nurses, and parents. Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you.
Respectfully, thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Mendoza. Okay, next on our agenda is our superintendent's report. Dr. Cavazos?
Thank you, President Mason. Just a quick thank you to all our high schools that were involved in graduation and all the staff that was involved in that, our principals, to teachers, to individuals who worked graduation, to central staff. Just a big thank you. Graduations were outstanding. They were very well done, and remarkably, that our students endured this year and remarkably well, and they showed their determination to make it to graduation. I'm just so proud of them and proud of our staff, and we turned the page on that, but congratulations to the class of 2021. As I mentioned in graduation, they're a special class that I'm very proud of. So that's my report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cavazos. Are there any other trustees with board reports? Okay, seeing no lights. Mrs. Secretary, do we have any items to consider this evening?
Yes, Madam President. 2 items. Bowie asked the staff to come back with total compensation, not just salary. And David asked that the Finance Committee be briefed as soon as possible on the results on STAR scores and gaps. Anybody else?
Very
And
good,
that is it.
thank you. So it is 9:15, and this meeting is adjourned.